seems to work. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jean-Michel Béaco, CEO of Institut Louis Bachelier. Well, I will try an exercise I don't like, which is to speak in front of you, but I will make it quick and maybe useful to everybody. Okay, welcome to this 15th Financial Risks International Forum. Let's call it Risk Forum, if you don't mind. And this is an international scientific forum, and as well as a flagship for Institut Louis Bachelier. Welcome Marie, welcome Stefano, Torinese come me. And I think it feels good. Well, I'm happy to be here with you, with this sun, and back again on this stage with these wonderful settings. A bit of feedback maybe to start with. Last time we were here physically was in 2019, if my memory is correct, if Stine wrote it right. And we discussed low interest rate environments, search for yield, risk management, and transitions. We were pretty good at that time, actually, because, well, it's still something which is very accurate today. In 2020, the Risk Forum was ready to kick off with the rise of fintechs. Can networks and platforms disrupt traditional financial intermediation? Again, a very accurate topic. Unfortunately, the COVID suddenly disrupted everything, so we did not manage to do it. Last year, in 2021, we discussed fintechs and COVID-19, learning from a pandemic crisis. Here again, a very accurate topic, maybe another one for today. Not at all, because we will keep the door open and we will try to avoid a cluster here. Okay, but still, this 2021 version was in a digital format, and that's why this year we come back with a new topic, and I hope a very accurate one around climate risk and green transitions. And we will do it physically and digitally. I will come back to this, but I think the topic is very relevant in the current, of course, international context. And at the time, France is heading, as you know, is carrying the chairmanship in Europe. And bravo to Marie, bravo to Christian, of the scientific committee, for having chosen this accurate topic. What did we learn during the last 2 or 3 years since we met? Well, what did we do? We didn't sleep, of course, but we try hard to draw lessons from the pandemic experience. And the first lesson is to become a hybrid, let's say. To experience the full program, it's better to be here together. But now we have enlarged our format, and we are able to have people online as well as you here. And this is the live stream format is one of the lessons we drew from the COVID, and I think it's something which allows the forum to give a more international format, which is good, I think, for everybody, including the one, again, who are here and who could benefit, of course, from the full format. Welcome to the people online, as well as welcome to you guys. This year we will offer more than 100 speakers, chairmen and chairwomen, and discussants who will be debating challenges and solutions related to climate risks and green transition. Okay, what are we here for today? As you know, the Risk Forum is organized by Institut Louis Bachelier. The scientific committee is assured the topic, as well as he developed the program and does the selection among the proposal for our call for papers, and one paper, I saw it, well, a few minutes ago, is one of the choice from a scientific committee. The Risk Forum aims to highlight methodological and regulatory challenges raised by the ongoing development in financial technologies and to discuss sustainable solutions. That's why we are here today. It has escaped no one that climate change is one of the key challenges of our time. Addressing it and addressing the transition of the world economy into a low carbon path will require support from the financial sector through large and innovative instruments. Tomorrow, for instance, we will have the insights from Stanislas Potier, who co-authored the recently published Rapport Perrier, which is about sustainable finance, especially sustainable finance path for the Paris Financial Center. And this sustainable finance path was requested by the Ministry of Finance and the French government. Transitioning our economy, and it's written in the report, will require new academic and regulatory developments that will be discussed during these 2 days of lively debates. Public, private and academic actors all contribute to the Risk Forum, and they are all needed in the development of the solutions. ILB exists on purpose to build bridges between these partners and create solutions useful to society, stakeholders, and solutions through research projects, conferences, and publications. Sometimes on a French scale, and sometimes with an international reach. The same goes for climate risks. Climate risks do not belong to any nation or any sector and can have consequences for all of us. So the Risk Forum is an excellent place to discuss it and discuss how to move forward. And we are very pleased to welcome speakers from the entire ecosystem, from France and from abroad. Before concluding, I wish to thank in advance the speakers, the participants, for, of course, your contribution and your quest for excellent research to support sustainable development in economics and finance. The organization of the event is heavy, and I have a look at the teams there, because so many people contribute with content. Thank you for making the Risk Forum heavy with us. I also wish to thank again Marie, without whom nothing would have been possible, and Christian is assistant for this time, okay? And it's new, it's very modern, you know, Christian is Marie's assistant. And of course, I wish to thank you warmly because you are engaged and you contribute to this forum to an extent which is impossible for ILB alone, and I think anybody here alone. So thank you again. I wish to thank, of course, the ILB team, especially the communication and engagement, Stine and Sen. The team did a lot of work to be here today, and it was a bet, actually. We did the bet in early January, and we just spoke with Christian. We thought that the bet was a good one, again, if we are able to keep it, to avoid the cluster and to be here together without any trouble. So I hope you will have a great Risk Forum, and we will walk away a little wiser in knowledge, richer in scope, and even more engaged in our partnership-driven research network, which is ILB. Marie, the floor is yours. Hopefully, we will stay 2 days with the sun, and I'm sure if not, the papers and all the research will become sun to everybody. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for a nice introduction. So my name is Marie Brière. I'm the chairwoman of the Scientific Committee of the Risk Forum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this 15th edition of the conference, this year on climate risk and green transition. So as Jean-Michel said, climate change is one of the key issues of our times, and the financial sector is highly needed to transition the world's economy to a low-carbon path. We need investment in R&D for new energies, in infrastructure, and we need also new products and funds. We need green bonds, climate derivatives, insurance solutions, green mutual funds to facilitate this investment in great projects. But to do that, so to transition efficiently, there is also an urgent need for academic research to understand and model the interactions between climate risk and our economies, and determine what could be an optimal path for the transition. The good news is that academics are very, very active on that field. Climate finance emerged as a new field in academia, and the variety of papers that will be presented during these 2 days is a very lively proof of it. And finally, I would like to stress that the role of supervisors is also key. Climate change became a systematic source of risk for our economies and financial markets, posing a serious threat to financial stability. We need financial institutions to disclose their climate risk exposure. Central banks and regulators are key to design scenarios for climate stress tests. So to discuss all these questions, we have the chance to welcome more than 100 academic speakers who will discuss innovative research on these questions. So I would like to thank them warmly for their participation, and in particular, our 3 academic keynote speakers. Stefano Giglio, professor at Yale. Stefano will discuss how to build portfolios that are hedging climate risk. We mentioned that there is a need for derivatives that are less existent, so how to cope with that and build climate hedging portfolio. Tomorrow, Irene Monasterolo, who is professor at EDEC, will present her latest research on cascading climate physical risk. And finally, tomorrow afternoon, Lucien Taylor, professor at the University of Chicago, will dissect green returns and show how investors' preferences for green assets have a key role in explaining asset return. On the practitioner side, as mentioned by Jean-Michel, we'll have the chance to welcome Stanislas Potier, who co-authored the recently published Rapport Pierrier requested by the French government. So Stanislas will share his view on the way the French financial actors could organize to align with the Paris Agreement objectives. As you know, and for those who are coming every year, the Risk Forum has a unique feature of gathering in the same place both academics and practitioners. We will have practitioners and academic roundtable, and for that, I would like to thank Peter Tankoff and Stéphane Voisin, Laurent Clerc and Jean Boissineau, Michel Crouy and Louis Bertucci for organizing 4 sessions on very important questions for the industry. We will have one today on data gaps, organized in partnership with the Green and Sustainable Finance Program of Institut Louis Bachelier. Tomorrow, we will discuss the future of climate stress tests with ACPR and Banque de France, the regulators and central bank. Then we'll have a panel session on how to green financial institutions' balance sheet, organized by Natixis. And last but not least, tomorrow evening, there will be a panel on the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining, organized with the Finance and Insurance Reloaded program, the FAIR program of Institut Louis Bachelier. So with that, I would like to thank all participants who are more numerous every year. We had more than 450 registered participants this year. I would like to thank our sponsors and the members of the scientific committee, of course, for their insights. In particular, Christian Goyerou, for his great help in the organization of the event. Now, Christian, I learned that you're my assistant. I'm very, very lucky to have such a great assistant. And of course, the conference couldn't exist without Institut Louis Bachelier. A big, big thank you to the teams, in particular, Jean-Michel Beaco and Stine Hansen. Stine is here. You did a great job for a crucial contribution to the organization of the event. And also the full communication and engagement team, in particular, Beatrice, Myriam, Feriel, and the whole team. So you have been really great, and thank you for that. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Christian, who will chair the first session and introduce Stefano. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great conference.
Okay, thank you. I am very pleased to introduce Stefano Giglio. Stefano received his PhD from Harvard University under the supervision of John Campbell. Yes, fine. And he occupied several positions as associate professor at the University of Chicago, at Booth, which is the business school of the University of Chicago, and is now full at the Yale University, Yale School of Management. So in this business school. He has published in various topics, and topics in which we are very interested. Just to mention a few, maybe some keywords: systemic risk, long-run discounting, which is something very, very important, hedging macro factors, bubbles, I have seen, and also, of course, climate change. And in fact, this is this latter topic on which he will present the paper, trying also to mix with hedging. And so, welcome, Stefano, and you can come. So, about 20 minutes for the presentation, and we will have time for questions. And if you have additional questions, maybe after the roundtable, since he is also attending the next roundtable. Thanks.
All right, so first of all, thank you very much, Christian, for the nice introduction. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me today. It's a pleasure. This is my first big post-COVID conference, so it's wonderful to be here. Today, as Christian was saying, I want to talk about hedging portfolios. In particular, I'm going to talk about how do we build hedging portfolios for climate risk. So this work is joint with Johannes Strobel, who's co-authored with me a bunch of papers. He's at NYU. Quinn and Julia are PhD students at NYU, and Georgie is an incoming PhD student at NYU as well. Okay, so I think I don't need to justify to you why we're interested in climate risk. It's a big risk, as you know. I think it's a complex risk, and many parts of society are interested in figuring out a solution to that. In this paper, I'm going to focus on a kind of more focused question on how can you use financial markets to hedge and transfer this risk. Okay, now this is an important question because we know that one of the important roles of financial markets is indeed to help us hedge risks and share risks. But the other side of this is that we don't have many of the typical tools that financial markets give us, right? For example, if for many other macro risks like inflation, you have specific derivatives that allow us to hedge that. But for climate risk, there's very, very little in this space. So if you're an investor and you want to hedge climate risk, there's kind of not much you can do to do so. And so basically, this kind of the second best is to try to build a hedging portfolio using instruments that you have easily available, like stocks. Okay, so here's what we're really trying to approach this as: we're not trying to build the optimal portfolio, like the optimal derivative contract on climate risk. We're going to take a second best and say, what's the best we can do with the instruments that we have, and particularly stocks. So this is something we already approached in a different paper with Rob Engel and Johannes and other co-authors, in which we basically really try to build a hedging portfolio, a kind of standard making portfolio, using information about the firm's exposure to climate risk, particularly their environmental scores. So in that paper, we applied kind of a standard making portfolio procedure, and I'm going to argue that we can do better than that. And in particular, in this paper, I will argue that when we're in an environment where there's very little time series data, standard approaches to build these hedging portfolios don't work well. And instead, we can do better by using cross-sectional information. Okay, so this paper I'm going to talk about today is called a quantity-based approach. It's really a way to kind of build these aggregate hedging portfolios by using cross-sectional information. So how can we do that? Well, to understand what we actually do in the paper, let me kind of spend 2 slides on the traditional approaches. Okay, so this one, there's, the line is a little bit blurred, but let's say we classify the existing approaches to build hedging portfolios into groups. One we call the narrative approach, and one we call the standard making portfolio approach. Now, when I say the narrative approach, what do I mean? I mean really any way to choose stocks that they pick stocks based on some prior information that we have. Okay, so for example, you might say, well, How do I identify stocks that do well when there's bad climate news or bad climate realization? Well, you can say, maybe I should buy solar companies, right? So, for example, if we all get more worried about climate risk and there's regulation coming in, solar companies might stand to gain. So that's one way to pick stocks. Another way to pick stocks would be to say, I'm going to look at the environmental scores and just going to assume that high E-score companies will do well and low E-score companies will do badly when climate risk materializes. Okay, so basically, my choice here is just based on a story that I tell that I think that captures some fundamental economic mechanism. Now, this, of course, is a very good way to build a hedging portfolio if your story is right. And if your intuition is wrong, you may get it wrong. Okay, so I'm going to argue. I'm going to show you some examples later with the data, just arguing that this is actually quite difficult to do. It's actually quite difficult. It's quite difficult to figure out ultimately with just some economic intuition which are stocks that tend to gain or benefit from climate change. Okay, so I'm going to compare this approach with the new approach we propose. So that's kind of at one extreme, is that, I'm not going to use the data, or I'm going to use very limited amount of data. I'm going to base my portfolio on intuition. The other approach at the other end of the spectrum uses a purely statistical approach and is a standard making portfolio approach. So how this approach works is, I take some target variable, for example, some measure of climate risk. Okay, you can use temperatures, you can use, I'm going to show you later a bunch of measures. Use a bunch of measures on the left-hand side. You project them onto a set of portfolio returns Z, and the coefficient of the regressions beta Z, these are going to be based on your portfolio weights. So intuitively, this statistical approach just says, look, I'm going to look in the past, and I'm going to look at which companies in the past benefited from climate risk, which did badly when climate risk materialized, and I'm going to go long short based on this information. So it's using basically a purely statistical approach. Now the problem with this is effectively that you have many stocks to choose between and very little data, because if you go, let's say, more than 10 or 15 years back, nobody in financial markets was pricing in climate risk. So, which stocks did well, well or badly, or how you identify these stocks that do well or badly depending on, when climate risk materialize. Well, that's something, you really have 10 years of data to build, okay? And that's just very little, so you're gonna basically be dominated by noise. So our new approach, okay, it's called a quantity-based approach, and it's trying to find, to add additional information to this statistical procedure. So I'm just going to give you the intuition in a couple of slides. So first of all, what this approach is built on is the existence of shocks that affect just a subset of investors. Okay, so that's a map of the US, that's Oregon, okay, and the assumption is that there's something happens in Oregon that only affects Oregon investors, and in particular that changes their beliefs about climate change. Okay, so here, you can imagine, for example, there's a local heat wave, right? So, when we think of heat waves, sometimes there are heat waves that affect the entire country, but sometimes there are heat waves that only affect one area or the other area. Okay, so imagine that here there's a heat wave that affects Oregon. What can we do? We can see how people trade in Oregon. In particular, what we're going to do in the paper is we're going to take mutual funds that are located in Oregon, where their headquarters are in Oregon. We're going to say, how do these mutual funds rebalance their portfolios after being hit by a heat wave? Okay, now while we're going to look at heat waves, really what we're trying to capture here is some event that changes people's beliefs about climate risk. Now you might wonder why is heat a good choice? It's because there's a bunch of studies that have shown that when people experience high temperatures, they actually do revise their beliefs about climate risk. Okay, I'm going to get back to that in a second. But so imagine that for now you have something that changes Oregon investors' beliefs about climate risks, and we're going to see how they trade. Then we're going to look at a different state. We're going to look at, say, Texas. Oh, there's a heat wave in Texas. How do people in Texas update their portfolios after they experience this heat wave, and so on. So notice that these local events, they might not affect prices at all, right? It's not clear that the global stocks might directly, or U.S. stocks that might be directly affected by local heat wave in Oregon. So these are events that might not move the prices, so they might be missed by the standard approaches. Okay, but our approaches look at quantities. They look at how people actually trade in response to these events. Okay, so effectively, we are learning the response, basically the demand for stocks, how the demand is shifted when you have an event that changes people's beliefs. And we're gonna do it based on only on these local shocks. Then what we're gonna do, we're gonna aggregate all these local shocks, and we're gonna say, well, if once I've seen how people trade in response to their local shocks, how do they change their portfolio? Are there stocks that people on average tend to buy and sell in response to these events? Okay? And we're gonna base our hedging portfolio based on this information. Okay? So not looking at all aggregate events, but looking only at these local events. And then what's the idea here? The idea is when then a global shock will hit, and let's say there's an increase in temperatures in the US, well then we anticipate that all these mutual fund managers, they will react in a similar way to how they reacted to the local shock. They will all go buy the same stocks, for example in this picture, solar stocks, and therefore they're gonna push up the price of solar. So if I had built my portfolio based on this or the local information, I would have bought, let's say, solar stocks. By the time that the heat wave affects the US, the demand will shift out. This will have a price effect and not just a quantity effect because it's an aggregate event, and my hedging portfolio will rise in value, okay? So the idea here is I'm not gonna choose my stocks, my long short side of a portfolio based on how stocks did in response to aggregate events, but based on how people responded, what stocks people bought and sold in response to local events that shifted their beliefs. That's a simple intuition of the paper. Okay, so now two things I want to tell you now in the next 10-15 minutes. I want to do one, I want to give you more details on how we actually build this portfolio, and two, I want to show you how this portfolio actually does when compared with the other methodologies. So how do we actually build our local measures? Okay, so given the narrative I just told you, the first approach we're going to have is to look at heat shocks. So, okay, so we want to identify local heat shocks. Now you could say, well, there's many different ways to think about that heat shock. Is it an absolute shock in temperature? Is a relative shock? Maybe absolute temperature in Florida and Minnesota is different, right? So maybe we want to do it relative. Maybe we can look at damages. So we didn't have a great way to choose either. So we actually built three different portfolios, each based on a different local shock. Okay. So we have three measures. One is a measure of injuries and fatalities, so whether there's a local heat shock that actually produces damage to human lives. Two is a second measure based on insurance payments to agriculture. And three, we're going to have an extreme monthly temperature, which is a relative measure. Okay, so we have three completely different measures of local shocks. For each of them, we see how mutual fund managers trade in response to each of the three, and we build three different hedging portfolios based on information. Okay, so remember we're going to end up with three different hedging portfolios. So two more things about these measures. One is that these three classes of shocks are actually very uncorrelated. Okay, so the question will be, if we're really capturing something about climate change beliefs, maybe we can hope to get similar portfolios. If these three measures are just inducing different trade for different reasons, we're going to end up with three very different portfolios. Okay. So I'll show you the table of these correlations later, but let me just say one more thing. The one encouraging sign is that each of these three types of heat shock is actually correlated with a local increase in searches for climate change in Google. Okay, so basically the point is, indeed, it seems like, consistent with existing research, when people experience a local heat shock, they do indeed change their beliefs in some way about climate change. So then, after doing this, we decide to also add a different approach, and this different approach is a different way to measure how mutual funds are changing their beliefs, and is based on the text published in the semi-annual filing of mutual funds. Okay, so mutual funds have to publish some disclosure filings every 6 months, so we just search these filings for climate change words, and we basically measure when they seem to add text related to climate change. So we're going to call that a belief shock, and we're going to see also how mutual funds trade in response to this kind of shock. And so basically, the idea is we're not going to have 4 portfolios, 3 of them based on heat shocks and 1 based on these changes in the beliefs of mutual funds direct. So, okay, so these are the shocks we're going to use. Okay, then the question is, how do we actually build our portfolio based on our shocks? Well, it's actually pretty simple. For each industry, we're going to do it at the industry level. There's too much noise in stocks, okay? So at the industry level, we compute a variable, which is the active change in a certain quarter by a certain fund for a certain industry, okay? Which is simply how much they buy and sell of that industry scaled by the industry size, okay? And then we're going to, this is kind of the main regression that allows us to build the portfolio. We're going to regress industry by industry. We're going to regress the active changes of all funds in that industry, basically on some time fixed effects and which capture the global shocks, and this S variable, which is basically just a dummy variable, whether you're exposed to a shock or not. Okay, so it's actually very simple. We're just asking for each industry. If I compare funds that in that quarter were hit by local shocks versus those that were not hit by local shocks, how do they change their portfolio allocation? Okay, that's it. And these betas are effectively our portfolio weights. We're going to go long those companies that funds tend to buy, and we're going to short those companies that funds tend to sell. Okay, so here are the correlations of the returns of the 4 portfolios. Okay, you can see from this table that these correlations, of course, are not 100%, but they're positive. They're much, much higher than the correlations of the underlying shocks. Okay, so again, this is capturing the fact that people seem to be, mutual fund managers seem to be reacting in similar ways to changes in beliefs as measured, or as induced, if you want, by all these different shocks. Okay, so armed with these four portfolios, now we can ask the question, how well do these portfolios hedge climate change measures out of sample? Now, here's the other hard question. What are we trying to hedge? Are we trying to hedge temperatures? Are we trying to hedge how people worry about climate risk, how much they search Google for it? It's not that easy, okay, to figure out how to measure this. So in this paper, we take a kind of general approach. We just say, we're going to just take a bunch of measures that other papers have produced. We're going to take about 10 measures. We're going to just ask each of these portfolios which measures it hedges best. Okay, so we're not going to take a strong stand on what's the right measure of climate risk. That's a very hard question that we don't address in this paper. We literally just ask, how does it do in hedging all these types of different measures of aggregate risk? And then the other thing I want to mention is that we don't have a lot of data to estimate our procedure. Okay, we don't really think that beyond, let's say, 10 years, there's much information in financial markets. So we're going to use 10 years of data, of which 5 years to train the procedure and 5 years to check the out-of-sample relation. Okay, so this is all to be taken with a grain of salt because it's just based on very little data. So, and this is the last thing I want to say before showing you the figure. On the next figure, what I'm going to talk about are going to be correlations. What are these correlations? They are out-of-sample correlations between the return of the hedge portfolio and the innovation of the change in the climate risk measure. Okay, so basically, my measure of victory would be how well the return of my portfolio correlates with shocks to climate risk. Okay, where my shocks are going to be all these different measures. Okay, so here we go. This is going to be a long picture. Okay, there's a lot of data in this picture. So, what does this picture show? First of all, you can see on the x-axis there are correlations. These are out-of-sample correlations, so they can be negative. Okay, they go all the way to minus 0.4 to all the way to 0.4. And then what you're going to see in this picture is a bunch of rows. Each row is going to be a different portfolio. Okay, so for example, this one here will be the portfolio, our hit portfolio, based on the fatalities injuries definition. And each group of dots that you see here, there will be the hedging performance with respect to one or more measures of climate risk. Okay, so for example, what is this blue dot here? You can go back to the legend down there. It's a paper by Ardia and co-authors. And what they do is they basically look at Wall Street Journal and try to use some machine learning to use some to extract the sentiment of the articles. So it's going to try to classify news as kind of good or bad news about climate change from the Wall Street Journal. That's an approach. You can think of it as an improvement over our older measure, which are the ones in blue in the light blue from the previous paper, in which we also look at the Wall Street Journal, but we didn't use sentiment. Okay, and then we had a different measure that was not looking at Wall Street Journal but was using sentiment. So this new Ardia measure is kind of better than our older measures. And so so what does this picture say is that when you use our approaches to hedge the measure by Ardia, what you do, you get about 25% out-sample correlation. Now, is this a glass half full or half empty? Depends a bit on your prior views. I would say it's 25% full and 75% empty. So basically, hedging macro risk is extremely hard if you ever try to use hedging portfolios to hedge anything else, okay? Consumption, industrial production, all these kind of aggregate measures. You're going to get, if you're lucky, 5%, okay? So relative to what we know about hedging macro risk is great. What we know, in general, if you're an investor trying to build a hedging portfolio, well, it's not so great because it's not perfect protection, okay? But at least it's some amount of hedging. Okay, and also to remember, this is completely also sampled where the training is based on 5 years of data. So it's a very difficult task, and so I think it's a pretty good result. Now, this is how these portfolio hedges are older measures, okay? And these are other groups of measures. I'm not going to discuss all of them in detail, but these are basically all these different dots are measures proposed by different teams of researchers. The orange one is natural Google search for climate risk, and the red one is just shocks to aggregate temperature. Okay, so you may or may not like the hedging performance for some measures, but overall you are getting broadly positive hedging performance across the board, which is again a sign to me that this measure is capturing this portfolio is hedging something that relates to climate risk. So let me just show you a few more things. These are our other portfolios. You can see that all of them do pretty well, okay? The one based on the mutual fund filings is a little worse, okay? I think they're just a bit more noisy. But, they broadly speaking, they give you positive hedging performance, okay? So in the last couple of minutes, let me just compare these results with the two alternative approaches, the narrative approach and the standard making portfolio approach. Okay, so for the narrative approach, I want to spend 30 seconds on it because it's kind of interesting. So here are 4 procedures, all based on our intuition of what we should buy and sell in response to hedge against climate risk. So first possibility is to buy PVD, which is a clean energy ETF. That's sensible. Second possibility is to short energy companies. XLE is an energy ETF. Well, they're also sensible because these are mostly polluting companies, and so you think, if the clean firms benefit, dirty firms probably lose. The third one is shorting the standard asset portfolio, basically XLE and coal. And then finally, you can just do basically a sorting by the E-scores of the companies, and you can just do a long short based on the E-scores, okay? So all these, I would say, are pretty sensible. When you look at the performance, they are the red ones. You can see they're very, very wildly different performance. PBD indeed looks like it's a good hedge, but then shorting traditional energy companies actually does terribly. Why? Because turns out, or at least that's our explanation, the traditional energy companies might actually be part of where transition is coming from, so they might also benefit from transition. That's what I'm saying. Base portfolios based on your pure intuition is hard, okay? So overall, you can see that these red lines, which are kind of the narrative approach, they have a much less consistent performance. And finally, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but these are the standard making portfolio regressions. You see they do pretty badly, simply because when you're trying to train a portfolio composition based on 5 years of data using only aggregate time series is basically an impossible task. Okay, and so that's it. Okay, so what we in the paper is we propose a new approach to hedge climate risk that is based on exploiting cross-sectional information. Now, it's useful in this, to hedge climate risk. We actually think that it's useful in other situations. It's useful when there are structural breaks, so you don't really have a lot of useful data. You think that data might have kind of dramatically changed. It's useful emerging risk. And we also show in the paper, which I didn't talk about here, that you can use the same approach to hedge other stuff, like house price risk and unemployment risk. But that's for a different forum. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
So thanks a lot. Yes, this one is better. Okay, thanks. So some question from the audience. Yes, Marie?
Yes, I have. It works. Yes, now it works. Okay, great. Thank you. So thanks, Stefano, for a great presentation. I have 2 questions. One, you mentioned you didn't want to choose between the climate measures you wanted to hedge, but I would like to ask you which one would you advise to hedge, because many of the climate measures you're using are a climate news measure, which are mixing fundamental information and sentiment. So how much popular are fundamental news in the press? So is this something we would like to hedge or not? Maybe we would like to hedge more fundamental information. So I would like to have your advice on that, because also we were discussing about the derivatives market. So what kind of measure should derivatives hedge if they were to develop? And another question is about the feasibility in practice. You do not show, for example, the turnover measure of the portfolio and transaction cost. And so how feasible is that for the professionals in the room to build this hedging portfolio?
Okay, great questions. Okay, so let me start from the end. The feasibility, yes, no, we have not looked at turnover, for example. That's certainly a concern. Let's say that we don't view this as something really directly implementable. It's more like a proof of concept. Okay, I think that if you were to implement this, there's a lot of additional things you need to think about. I mean, ultimately, so these measures don't directly rely on a particular target, which it's a plus and a disadvantage in some dimensions, right? So if you have something specific in mind, then you might want to try to hedge directly that. These ones are built just on some exogenous kind of measure of shocks, right? So they, in a sense, they don't force you to think too hard about that, which is why we picked 10 measures. But so let's say that there's a lot of, bringing this to actually implementable portfolio. I think there's a bunch of steps, including, thinking about transaction costs and so on. So these, I don't know, because I suspected, the measure as it is now is not extremely implementable. That said, let me say another thing. We have not looked at turnover, but these portfolios are actually pretty stable. In the sense, what we did is we did check over time how these betas or the weights of the different industries. First of all, let me say one thing before. It's implemented at the industry level, first of all, right? So it doesn't require you to trace stock by stock. That already makes it a bit easier. Second, these industry weights are actually relatively stable. It's work in progress, but we want to plot a picture of how much they vary. So that kind of gives you some indication of turnover. So I have not checked, but I don't think the turnover is going to be crazy here. So that's one. That's your second question. Now, to go back to your first question is, how do you choose? So I can tell you how we thought about this as we was working on these papers, especially the other papers where we had to actually take a stand on a measure. So here's my view. If you can build a derivative portfolio, then, if you can build a derivative instrument, then you want to link it to the actual final damage. So, whether that's final temperature or actual damages, that can be as far away as you want, right? So then, in a sense, the price of the derivative over time kind of reflects people's information about that fundamental damage. Of course, it can still reflect sentiment. There's no way around the differential markets, but at least you can, it's directly linked to the final damages that we have. That, I think, is the optimum. With stocks, you can't do that. And so the idea the idea that we had to look at news was basically trying to follow up on this kind of very old idea of, if I have to replicate a long-term payoff, but I can only take short-term securities, I can try to rebalance in the same way we hedge options, right? Using a hedging portfolio, in theory, what you want to do is you want to hedge the changing risk-neutral expectations of the final payoff. Are Wall Street Journal articles really risk-neutral expectations? They're not, but I think that's as close as we can get. So that was the idea of using news. I think still it's a valid idea. In terms of implementation, it's still hard because you know exactly how you build it. I think there's a lot more work to be done. And there's the issue that you mentioned, which is everything we do here is affected by sentiment. And maybe the most fundamental thing we can get are maybe projections from climate scientists. Maybe that's the best we can do, but that has its own set of problems also. So none of this has an easy solution. Yeah. Thank you.
Some other questions? Maybe I have one question in this case. In fact, your analysis focused on this idea of distinguishing local and global geography, in geography. Okay? And I have the impression that this is a single dimension, whereas it is useful to have a second dimension, which is local versus global in time, which is not the same. So you have these two indexes. Just to explain what I have in mind, if you are interested in the change in heat, for instance, intuitively you can have some change on the mean, on trend, something like that, or change on the variance, which is not the same. So you can have more serial persistence, which is something, or more extreme events, even if you have no change of persistence. And I have some difficulty to see how you will take them together. For instance, in your definition of equilibrium, this is a static equilibrium, this is not a dynamic one. And if you have a dynamic, you have to distinguish also local and global in time.
Absolutely. So you're completely right. I think from the, I think that the time series properties of these climate shocks and the climate events in general are super interesting. And I think that, in fact, it seems like one of the, the change in the mean, in a sense, is the long-term effect of climate change, but the biggest short-term effect is changing the volatility. So that seems like to be really of primary importance. For this paper, we have not done anything like that, but certainly we could think about trying to disentangle, for example, what are transitory shocks versus, more persistent shocks, or what are, which of these shocks actually are more like a, variance, they change really the variance or not. So that's a great suggestion. We have not looked at. Yeah. Thank you.
Question. Yeah. Christian, yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
I have a question, Stefano. The first one really relates to what Christian said. How do you cope with non-linear nature of physical risk, climate change physical risk, basically to capture this dynamic in time? And more importantly, the second one is, aren't you concerned that this type of hedge basically sends the wrong signal to the market on the ability to basically hedge against climate risks when the real issue is really to divest from the assets which are at risk, typically the fossil asset?
Okay, so fantastic question. So on the first question, I think on the nonlinearities, I think the idea goes back to what I was saying to Maggie before, which is so suppose that you could imagine you could write a ideal derivative on this kind of long-term temperature, right? The derivative would be completely hedging all the true process, no matter what the nonlinearities are, right? Let's say that temperatures, for example, they have this peak point where everything kind of goes wild. Well, of course, if you have a derivative written on temperatures, then you're going to be completely hedged. And the idea would be again that you can kind of hedge along the way with a dynamic portfolio. That's the theory. Okay. Now, will the practice based on Wall Street Journal articles do that? Well, maybe we'll hedge part of it and part not. But certainly, let's say the following. At least I think we have a good idea where we want to go, and this is a first step in that direction. So conceptually speaking, I think the linearities are easy to take care of because we have all these dynamic portfolio results from like 50 years ago. Then the other, sorry, what was your second question? I forgot. Oh yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So I've been thinking a lot about that too. And the question is it possible that actually having good insurance products will have basically some back consequence for how much we actually want to mitigate today? So here I don't know in equilibrium, like ultimately what is going to happen. Let's say that we're at the stage where we basically have no hedging at all, or almost no hedging. And so I think that the marginal effect is pretty small for now. Maybe if we did have perfect hedging, which I don't think we'll ever have, that concern will be kind of more problematic. I want to mention one thing though, which is I see the two approaches as complementary in the sense that it's true that it's very, very important, and I completely agree with that. It's very important to do mitigation ex ante right now, but I also do think that despite all the mitigation we might do, there will be some residual climate risk, and there's still scope for hedging that part. So, for example, we know now that there's some irreversibility in the climate change that has already occurred. Even if we start cutting emissions very drastically, there will be some irreversible component, and I really don't believe we aren't really going to cut the emissions as fast as we hope we are. And so there will be certainly some residual risk. So I think that it's important to have instruments to hedge that part. Is there an interesting interaction? Probably. I don't think we know very well how that works, but it's a good concern.
So I think that we have to close this session. Okay, thanks a lot, Stefano.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks.
And we will have a roundtable, so you can stay if you want. Okay? And you can continue to ask questions to Stefano after the table.
Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to the panel on data needs and gaps for sustainable finance research. I would like to ask the panelists to take their seats. So from left to right, we have Stefano Giglio, who has already been introduced, Jocelyn Martel, who is professor of finance at ESSEC, Léa Griset, who is a sustainable and green finance expert at NGFS and Banque de France, Thibaut Barrault, who is a data scientist at Institut Le Bachelier, and finally Stéphane Loisan, who is expert at European Platform on Sustainable Finance and director of the Green and Sustainable Finance Program at Institut Le Bachelier. And I'm Peter Tenkov. I'm professor of quantitative finance at Ensayon Institut Polytechnique de Paris, and also scientific director of the Green and Sustainable Finance Program at Institut Le Bachelier. So in this panel, we will have two parts. In the first part, we will discuss the questions, and in the second part, we will the panelists will present a number of initiatives to give some suggest some answers to these questions. First of all, I would like to ask Stefano to give his point of view on the most pressing data needs and most important gaps to advance sustainable finance research.
So I had 3 slides or something. You
yes, I guess.
Thank you.
But these are not the right slides, I guess.
No, these are, I think.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. What am I supposed to do? Wait a second. Okay. I will wait. Anyway, I will start telling you what I'm going to talk about, which is makes the thing a bit faster. So, all right, in just 3 slides, so it's going to be fast. So I just wanted to make basically 3 points. One is trying to think about, even before we go to the actual data needs, I want to spend 1 slide on, where do these data gaps actually come from? And then I'm going to talk about what I think are the most important data gaps for investors and for researchers. So this is maybe the most important slide is actually why do we have data gaps in sustainable finance research? Okay, where do these data gaps come from? Well, there's really, I think there are 4 main issues here. One is obviously just the complexity of the climate system and the climate econ interactions. That's something that is going to be very hard to solve. I mean, basically it's going to be solved by better modeling, but modeling climate risk is hard, modeling how they affect the economy is hard, so that's the first challenge. The second one is incentives. I think we don't have very good incentives to produce good data, or at least we didn't have so far. I think the incentives are getting improved. But basically, part of the issue is that, it's not clear the markets are actually rewarding disclosures, and, so there's actually some empirical work that's shown that, at least in the last few years, the markets have actually punished firms that disclose their emissions, for example. So that's one thing. So that's something that's going to be slowly solved by the fact that, simply because there's more demand for this, for having good information. And then the second is that the issue of both greenwashing and leakage, which is basically saying, I can avoid disclosing bad stuff if I put this bad stuff away and I move it to a different country or to different firms. So these are, basically, I think we need to first of all think about the alignment of incentives in order to kind of help produce good data. Then the third issue is what we already talked about, which is, we don't even know what is the right target for this. And in fact, if you look at ESG scores produced by different companies, they all seem to measure something different. They have basically very little correlation. And so part of the movement in terms of producing good data will be how do we decide what are the right thing to measure? Okay, and again, that requires some collective action, maybe some intervention from governments. And finally, a final point I want to make is that I find markets are in general pretty uninformed about this. There are many cases where actually we can learn a lot of stuff from markets, but here markets are basically as uninformed as everybody else, and so, or you can say as informed if you want, but yes, but there's still pretty little information, and so there's actually not a lot of scope, I think, to learn from markets, and there's much more need for kind of fundamental information that digs inside the firms. So given these reasons for the data gaps, what do I think are the main data gaps? Well, for investors, obviously the main issue is to figure out who's going to win or lose in response to climate change. And in particular, I think in addition to current emissions, it's important to think about future emissions, right? And the endogenous response of firms to regulation. That's obviously hard to do, but at least firms are now starting to make kind of public plans about how they're going to think about cutting emissions or changing their business. There's many other sources of exposures that are really very business by business, so it's kind of difficult to generalize them. And then the other thing, there are two other things I feel are very important to figure out, where I think we have huge gaps. One is that it's very difficult for now to integrate data from these physical models into our business decisions. That's important. You know, basically, all these inputs enter scenario analysis and projections and so on. And the other is all the R&D that goes in the opposite direction. So, you know, we may be lucky, we might have some breakthrough, you know, innovation that helps us go around these climate problems, but we also need information about that to figure out if a firm is exposed, how a firm is exposed to climate risk. And finally, if you're looking at this from the point of view of a researcher, then there are additional problems, because the researchers want to think about the general equilibrium. Okay, they want to think about how to do optimal policy, and so you need to really think about the general equilibrium effects. For example, what are investors' motivation? That's something we don't know a lot about. That there's some we should try to know more about, because that derives a lot of the behavior of firms. We need to think about the response of firms to climate policies. We need to think about the entire network of exposures and not, you know, of emissions. Sorry. And finally, the systemic risk implications. So on all of these, I think basically these are all kind of points where we need better data. Now, how to go about that? These are, you know, 5 suggestions, which are, you know, I think by now pretty understandable. One is that we need coordination. We need coordination with the governments and between firms on how to standardize contracts and the targets. I think we need to mandate disclosures, because, you know, not because the private market wouldn't get here on their own, but because they would get here on their own too late. And I think we need to action much earlier. I think we need verification of information, probably from the public sector, to make sure that there's no falsification. And we need, of course, we need a lot of international cooperation, because of leakage across countries. And then finally, I think we need a better interface to these physical models. Okay, those are my very, very fast thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the questions, we will have time for questions at the end. And now I would like to ask Jocelyn to give his view on the same topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefano. Obviously, I couldn't agree more with what you said. It's always difficult to come after, but I just want to illustrate this, I guess, with 2 examples, which I think will give a wider vision of what I think is the main problem with the data in sustainable finance and ESG in general. A year and a half ago, I was contacted by 2 friends of mine who are top managers in a very large private equity firm. And they said, we know you work on ESG data, and we would like to know more about it. I said, well, that's strange. I mean, you use ESG data in your investment decision. They said, yes, but we don't know what we use. We have ESG data. We have no idea what they mean. We have a provider. We have ratings. But we use them because investors want us to use them, but we don't know exactly what we're doing with it. So he said that's a bit of an issue, because basically we don't know if the data is good. We don't know how it was constructed. We don't know where it comes from, but we have to use them because investors ask us to use them. So they said this is a bit of a concern for us, because we don't know if we're making the right decisions based on this data. Clearly, they're not basing their decision only on that data, but they're using it to allocate capital. And maybe they're concerned about whether or not the capital is correctly oriented. So at the same time, I turned out to be in discussion with a large data provider, ESG data provider. And because in the context of PLEDZIFEST that we're going to discuss eventually, and Stefan is also working on this, and the ALB team is working on this, we were interested in getting access to raw data, not ratings. I mean, rating is just a black box that you shake and you get something out of it, and I'm not too sure as a researcher. I'm never really sure what's coming out of it, what was put in the box, and how it was shaken. So I have always had a little bit of difficulty using that type of data. So we wanted to get access to the raw data. I mean, for example, CO2 emission, water usage, and women on board, on staff, all these fatalities at work, all these raw data that you can get. After a long discussion, they granted me access to their database. So I have over 12,000 companies in the data. They sent me the file, and they said, have a look at it. I said, okay. So I dig into it and I looked at it. And what I found is, from a research point of view, quite interesting. Basically, 75% of the cells in the data set are empty. There's no data. They don't know. Sometimes they have estimates. Sometimes they simply don't know. So I told them, how come there's so many missing values? They said, we don't know. I said, yeah, but me as a researcher, if I'm going to use a data set and 75% of the data set is empty, I'm not too sure what I can infer from this. They said, well, that's the best we can do, and there's nothing we can do about it. And this is a large data provider. Now, there's one positive point on this. The most documented variables are the climate variables. CO2 emissions, scope 1, scope 2, water usage. Strangely, women on board, for example, are not very well documented. When you think they should be easy to measure. I mean, you go in a board, you see the number of women. I mean, that should be able to measure. So even easy variables to measure are not well measured. So that means, yeah, data is very important. I mean, for what we do, from a research point of view, for policy recommendation, it's very important. For asset managers, I mean, imagine now trillions are being, managed using ESG information. And this raises a concern about if the capital is correctly oriented, because that's what we use to make capital allocation. So, the data is extremely important. We need data. But I'm very concerned about the quality of the data that we have now and whether or not this data is correctly used to make capital allocation. So clearly, there's a huge need to develop more data and maybe have regulators insisting on disclosing the data, because one thing, even for the climate data, this is disclosed by self-revealed by companies. You need data which can be verified. When I take a stock price, whether I go on one provider or another, it's the same stock price. When I use accounting data, I know they've been verified, they've been certified. I can use them, I can trust them. Now, sometimes there could be problems with the data, but I can deal with this. When I see ESG data, I'm being very, very careful, because I'm not sure they've been verified, certified, and I'm not sure I can even verify them myself. So I think we have to be very careful and come back to what Stefano was saying. There's a huge need to have more clean and clear data to be used for research and for policy making. Thank you very much.
So next I would like to ask Stefan to give his point of view on the issue, in particular in relation to your work for the European Commission.
Yes, thank you. I think what Stefano said was very interesting. I will add some point on the missing gap which related to Pladifest, which is the frequency, basically. We have a data time gap, which is quite important. And this is also important in respect to the work of the European Commission. What Peter is touching upon is basically the fact that we participate to the design of the European Green Taxonomy, and we specifically contribute to the data and usability of this taxonomy, which is not easy and require sound data to do the work. When it comes to the time gap, it's basically the fact that usually most ESG data are based on company reporting, which are published sometimes 1.5 years after the data, and sometimes 2 years after the data is collected. So that means right now in 2022, most ESG analysts are working at the best with 2020 data, when obviously financial analysts are looking at 2022 to 2024 to even 2025 estimates to run their financial models and to basically run the investment decision process. So you have basically a 4 to 5 years data gap between what the sustainability, let's say, community use and what the financial practitioners need. So that's the first one that we need to close. It's this time gap. The second one also is the fact that in most cases you have only one data per year. So it's when you get the data, basically you only have one data per year, so it's not very dynamic. For the carbon footprint, most cases you have one data, it's very photographic, and you will have the carbon footprint of a specific company in 2019 right now, start to have it in 2020, and obviously if you want to run, so first of all you need more granular data, for example, you will need exactly the granularity of where the carbon emission comes from, so what type of activities, etc. For the taxonomy, obviously, we need a granularity on the activities, I mean the economic activities at a company level. But if you want to basically run a proper risk analysis, you need this data to be more prospective. So this is a question I think some of you will, or maybe Lisa will touch upon, about creating a more dynamic trajectories with carbon emissions to fill this gap, but also to be more granular in order to have the information not on an entity level, but an activity level. This is very important. I mean, a big hurdle we have on the taxonomy is try to project the taxonomy and to create basically a transition plan at a sector level to understand basically how much a certain industry, like the cement industry, like the utilities industry, like the car industry, can basically improve their greenness, or what are they really their tough decarbonation threshold, and how fast they can meet this threshold. And we obviously need commitments and guidance from the companies themselves, and most analysts actually use this guidance, but in most of the time they're not so much reliable. As you know now, many companies have net zero commitments. It's quite hard to analyze in practice the credibility, the robustness of his commitments, and we need obviously some actual very granular data to support that analysis and to basically to get confidence in these trajectories. Typically, we need asset level data on the plants. We need obviously data on the capex, but at very granular levels, and this type of data, which are totally missing at present. So this is a few examples of the data need, and I agree. I think it's something that we know at Institut Louis Bachelier. The same data, we need to know what we do with this data. We use it. We don't use the same data for risk purpose and for alignment purpose. It's very different. So then you need to know exactly if you're going to use this data for risk, for alignment, or even for impact measurement. And sometimes you don't need the same data, and you need to understand the methodologies behind the data in order to meet your investment objective.
Thank you, Stéphane. So now we will move to the solutions part, and I will first ask Léa to present the NGFS data repository initiative that she's working on.
That's work, yeah. Can I get the remote, please? Yeah, because I thought I sent a few slides. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So indeed, moving on to the solutions, I hope. I will tell you a bit about the work that the NGFS is being doing on climate-related data for about one and a half year. So I will assume that you all know what the NGFS is, because for the sake of time, I will not have time to elaborate more on it. But it's a Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, which was created in 2017, and that brings together today 108 central banks and supervisors, and who is carrying on work to improve the integration of climate-related risk by the financial sector stakeholders and to scale up green finance more broadly. And so the NGFS is also conducting work on climate-related data. In order to do so, we have set up a dedicated work stream on bridging the data gaps back in July 2020, with the aim to identify and prioritize climate-related needs and gaps, and also to propose policy recommendations to bridge those gaps. So in terms of governance, this work stream is co-chaired by Fabio Natalucci from the IMF and Patrick Amis from the SSM. And so the main product that we have came up with so far is a progress report that we have released in May 2021 in order to it was pretty much a progress report on the first stage of our work, so all the initiatives that we have carried out from July 2020 till about February 2021, when we started to draft the progress report. So in terms of basis, let's say, so this progress report has been informed by a literature review, and then many interactions with lots of international organizations like the OECD, for instance, or the FSB, and to a vast number of relevant stakeholders in the field of climate-related data, like, for instance, WWF, SASB, the IPSF, all these kinds of organizations. We have also gathered information thanks to a survey and to various workshops that we have held in the beginning of last year. And the aim of the progress report, besides reflecting on the work that we had been carrying out since the creation of the work stream, was also to lay the groundwork for the comprehensive assessment of climate-related data needs and gaps that we are supposed to do as part of our mandate. And so to do so, we used the repository that we have built, and about which I will talk in a minute. So we drew some preliminary analysis from this repository to inform this progress report. So I will not elaborate more on the data needs and gaps that we have found, because I would only repeat what's already been said. Policy-wise, the progress report also features the three main building blocks that we have identified to bridge the gaps and to be able to have data of a better quality, so data that would be both reliable and comparable, these kinds of issues. And so those three building blocks are a rapid convergence towards a common set of global disclosure frameworks, efforts towards minimally agreed upon taxonomies, and also work to have a more transparent use of well-defined and distinctly useful metrics and methodological standards, which are also today, which hinder today the access to data of good quality. So in order to start doing this assessment, we decided to adopt a user-centric approach in order to identify in a systematic way the climate-related data needs of the financial sector stakeholders. So based on a classification that we have come up with of 6 main stakeholders categories and 6 main use cases that I suppose you can see on the graph, but the font is not this big. So in terms of stakeholders, you will find the central banks, the supervisors, credit institutions, insurers, pension funds, and other buy-side entities, like asset management companies, for instance. And then in terms of the most common use cases for climate-related data, you would have exposure quantification, investment and lending decisions, macroeconomic modeling, forward financial stability monitoring, disclosures, and then scenario analysis and stress testing. So we have built this repository based on this classification in order to map all the climate-related data needs of those across these stakeholders categories and use case categories. So in order to do so, we built a 3-layered repository of data needs that you can see on the graph, in which we recorded, based on all the initiatives that we have carried out, the use cases, metrics, and raw data items across all those stakeholders categories. So the repository, as I just said, a layered structure. So first, the use cases are mapped onto the metrics that support them, and then the metrics are mapped onto the raw data items that are needed to construct the metrics. So the idea would be to have like a catalog of data needs and also availability, because in doing so, in mapping the needs, we also took stock of the availability or unavailability of the climate-related data items that we found. And so what we would like to do in a first stage would be, because we are supposed to publish a final report later on this year. We would first like to use the repository to draw evidence-based conclusions about the data needs, the data items that must be bridged with priority. So in terms of priority, the data items that would be the prioritary ones will most likely be the ones that support the most use cases or the most metrics, because this way, thanks to the repository, we can identify the data needs of an idiosyncratic nature from those of a more systematic natures. And so addressing the data needs of a more systematic nature is most likely to make the biggest difference in the consideration of climate-related risk by financial stakeholders. And in the second stage, we would also like to make our repository a tool that maximizes the public availability of climate-related data, and that could also offer practical solutions to bridge the gaps. So since the publication of this progress report last year, we have put a great deal of work in finalizing our repository. So we have extended it thanks to an important outreach exercise with methodology providers to be able to have more data, to map more data needs, and also to find the missing link to their availability or unavailability. We have also we've done a great deal of work in harmonizing all this repository, and we also built a web interface for this repository that we hope to put live in the months to come. And so the idea would be to use this finalized repository to draw our conclusions on the data gaps that must be bridged with priority as part of the publication of our final report in late May, beginning of June, we hope. And the idea would also then be to disclose this repository in its web format alongside the progress report in a format that is still to be decided, but that would be the plan.
Thank you very much. Now, in the last 10 minutes, I think what we shall do is we will present the Pladifest project. The Pladifest project is a so-called EQIPEX, so large equipment project funded by the French National Research Agency, and whose goal is to create a database of financial, ESG, and extra-financial data. It is a partnership between CNRS, ESSEC, and Louis Bachelier Institute, and so I will first leave the floor to Jocelyn to present, as now in his head, as a member of Pladifest project, to start the presentation, and then Thibault will conclude with the green value, green data part.
I think there must be slides. No, that's not the one. Oh, that's the one. That's right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yes, as Peter was saying, the ELB, ESSEC, and the CNRS, we submitted a project for an EQIPEX financing. This is the French government financing, and we got the it's gone. It's normal. Oh, it's coming. Okay. And the idea basically was to build a framework, a platform where you would have at the same time financial information and extra financial information on companies. Okay. So this project basically started from something which already existed. Okay. I'll come back to my slides and I'll follow up. So there's three parts. There's the green value part, which is by the ELB. This is the data on climate. The director is Pierre Willion and Peter Tankov, and they're working with Louis, Stéphane, and others. There's the daily financial and ESG data, but which is I'm responsible for at ESSEC. And there's the high-frequency financial and news data, which is the BEDUFI part. This is the high-frequency trading data, which is Patrice Fontaine is responsible for. So these, basically, these projects existed. The idea was to get financing to structure all of this together and to have a platform where you would have access. So for researchers, this is data for researchers, where researchers would have access to financial information on companies, on high-frequency data, and on ESG and green value data. Okay. So the idea was to further develop the Eurofida ESSEC daily and BEDOFI and expand the existing database to increase coverage to Asia Pacific, Oceania, and Middle East, to include ESG data, which is something we're here to discuss, and I think it's very important to be able to match at the same time financial and extra financial data, and to develop the Green Value project with the objective to create a green and sustainable finance database with customized AI-based indicators. This platform would be open to researchers and for research in finance and climate finance. Okay. Also, the idea was to sort of create a network to pool researchers in mathematics, AI, finance, and develop an international network of researchers, and to be able to test new models, new algorithms, and AI techniques, so that people could use this for research purposes. So in a nutshell, the project was launched in October last year. That's right, 2021. Yeah, it was launched in 2021. So we're already working. As I said, I'm responsible for the daily part, daily financial part. Patrice for the African Sea, and Peter and Pierre-Louis and Stéphane and they're working on and Thibault, they're working on the green value part. So we're moving slowly, but we're moving. The hope is to get a platform to where researchers would have access to all this type of information, so they can conduct their own research.
Thank you. Now, your turn, Thibault. Thibault will present the green value part of Platyfest project.
Yes. Can I just have, yes, thanks. Okay. So, okay. I will speak for the green value part, green value data part. Okay. So, basically what we did so far is like submitting surveys. So we submitted 3 kind of surveys so far since October 2021. The first one for the academic, so for researchers. The second one for data providers, and the final one for financial practitioners. As you can see on the slides, we did not receive a lot of answers, but we were still able to we still managed to get some outputs from this, and especially what we can understand from the surveys is that the data gaps that affect the green finance and green and sustainable finance world in a large sense are the same for both academic and financial practitioners. So this is mostly about a lack of granularity, standardization, transparency, and reliability of the data, as it has been already discussed. And also maybe a point which is like really important to me, I think, and especially for researchers, is that most of the data providers and also ESG data providers usually allow academic researchers to access their data, even if a specific process is not actually existing. So what I can advise you today is to contact data providers if you encounter some that have data that you want to use, because sometimes they can help you using them, even though it's not something that they usually do. Then something that we are planning to release really soon is a mapping of ESG data providers. So the idea is that we worked on a cartography in order to map use cases, sustainable finance use cases in a really wide sense again, and with like the currently existing ESG data providers, in order to help both researchers and financial practitioners to find the data providers that can help them with their sustainable finance use case. So this is an online tool that will be able for free, and that we are planning to release like end of March or in April. And it will be at first available on the Institut Louis Bachelier website, and then maybe on a dedicated website for Platyfest. And then like the heart of the green value data part of the Platyfest project. So this will be the execution of projects for custom data creation for research in green and sustainable finance. So the idea is that we will fill the gaps by using either currently existing data or creating new data from open source data sets. And we will be doing so through like buying existing data and transferring it to researchers. We will also like operate wide range of preprocessing to the data in order to ensure interoperability of different databases. And also we are planning to construct if any needs, new data through machine learning algorithms, such as computer vision or NLP on like disclosure text, in order to be able to answer researchers' needs for green and sustainable finance data. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Thibault. So now we have still a few minutes left for questions from the audience, or maybe those who are connected online to the online platform. Yes, please.
Hello. It's more a question for Stéphane, because when you were talking about the horizon problem for the data, the fact that we had some gaps in time and sometimes some delay, it seems that we are trying to fit in the regular financial analysis framework, but maybe for climate and environmental issues, maybe we should adapt that kind of time frame to have something that is more related to mid or long term, and not trying to fit in something that is not really adapted to that kind of very short-term horizon. What do you think of that? Should we try to have some more long-term analysis that is not purely financial? Because here it seems that we are really trying to fit extra financial models into financial models.
Okay, now if I understand correctly the questions, yes, you're right. We need to be more prospective, and the model needs to be more prospective. And the data gap, there's, as I said, the time gap, there's the frequency gap. There's also the tragedy of the horizon that's basically beyond 2020, 25, 30. I mean, probably, a DCF will look up to 2030 at the best. We are blind, basically, and basically we need to build these models. Now I will be a bit more optimistic, because we are moving from we're entering a new era. Before we were in a voluntary environment for reporting data. With the help of the European Commission, at least in Europe, we are entering in a new world of regulated reporting data. So with, as you know, with the CFRD, which is implemented this year, with CSRD, with taxonomy regulation, we have, overall there is 50 climate or environmentally regulated regulations or directive which are being implemented in Europe. All of them have a data reporting issue. So we're going to be basically loaded with very good data in the next futures, 2023, 24, which will start. As you know, the European Commission is building a platform to receive all these new data provided by all the regulated bodies, entities in Europe. So we're going to be full with data, and I think we'll be also in a good position to create better trajectories, thanks to the consistency of this, let's say, photographic data, to create the movie, the dynamic views. We get lots of data on CapEx. As you know, the taxonomy is CapEx oriented. So we get also some prospective data. And I think all of these will fill the models. I think what we will need to fill still is the frequency, because the data will maybe prospective, one may not be so frequent, and also the usability. I think this is another question. What do we do with this data? Is it a good data or not?
Another question from the audience, perhaps? Yes, sure.
If I may just add one thing, I think what the discussion has been going on, I think is a very interesting one, because it's true that there's a big gap between the frequency at which the ESG data is reported and the frequency at which financial information is reported. All right. So imagine bid or fee, we have high frequency data, try to match ESG data with high frequency data. I mean, the time frame is not at all the same. This being said, there's more than just raw data. One thing that people are doing now, like Stefano, there's news data, social network data. So some data providers now are not looking at raw data themselves. They're looking at social network data, and they're trying to see how the market reacts to this. And all this news information, they may come on a consistent basis, and they have very clear time at which they're happening. And when you have that type of information, it's probably much easier to match this news information, the time at which this is happening, with what's going on in the market. So I think you see more and more papers now using news and social network data to try to see what's their impact on the market, rather than looking at the raw data themselves. And that's probably two different sources of information that may help us better understand what's going on.
Other question? Okay, this doesn't seem to be the case, and it's probably time to conclude the roundtable anyway, so let us thank all the panelists.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now we move to the breakout rooms. So those willing to stay in this room for one of our sessions. Otherwise, there are two other rooms, one here and the other one on the other side of the building for the other two sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you work with Brian Kelly?
Yeah. Brian and I go back a long time.